Good morning, everyone, and happy start to your week. While people are still trickling in to this webinar, I'd like to give you all a nice welcome and an introduction to what we will be discussing today. You can already see that my panelists are here with me, and today we'll be discussing about breaking the bottleneck, strategies to overcome current construction constraints in Spain. But before we kick it off with the discussion, I would like to start with with a bit of information with regards to Solarplaza. So in case you don't know us, it's our business to accelerate the sustainable energy transition. And we do this by organizing solar energy conferences throughout the world. So I invite you to check out the website because this webinar is in preparation to our upcoming Spanish conference happening in July. And a little bit more about Solarplaza, I invite you to check out our consultancy and also our foundation in case you're interested in what else do we do beyond our conferences. Now, I know that we tend to get a lot of questions on this topic. So I want to assure you that if you have any questions or any technical difficulties, please drop that in the chat function on the right-hand side of your control box. We have a technical support team here to help you out. And also use the question button to put in your questions to the panelists. I invite you to put in the questions as we're speaking. We will try to get through as many questions as we can, and there's no need to wait until the end of the webinar to put your question in. The sooner we see it, the better. Last but not least, we will be sharing all of these slides and we will be sharing the recordings of this webinar with all of you via email, so it's not lost. Now, to give you a bit of a context, we'll be starting with a bit of an introduction, and then we'll jump into the discussion with our three great panelists today, and closing off with the Q&A with the audience. And to give you an introduction to our speakers, I'm kicking it off with Ines Monroy. Ines, and I hope their camera's is it frozen for you too? Well, I'm sure she'll come back online in a moment. But Ines has been active in this solar sector for quite a while, working on the EPC and O&M side, and not just in Europe, but also in Latin America and Asia Pacific. And right now she's working as an independent consultant, specializing in C&I self-consumption and large-scale projects with a focus on sustainability and community support. We also have with us here today David Diaz, a partner at Watson Farley & Williams, who specializes in the regulated sectors and public law and really focus on energy, environment, waste, and public infrastructure. And he has a lot of experience advising companies throughout this sector. And I'm very excited to have him here as well, seeing as he is part of the board of the Spanish PV union at UNEF. So excited to hear his legal perspective on the current bottlenecks. And last but not least, we have with us Cristina Rentel, a senior associate at Aurora Energy, and her experience modeling for the sector and her previous experience at Bank Sabadell really provide a great context for the conversation we'll be having today. Finally, I invite our speakers to the discussion, and we can even remove the slides from the screen. And I'll kick it off with a general question, and Cristina, I'll direct this question to you as first. Which is, we've clearly faced a lot of changes these past few years in the sector, the COVID pandemic, supply chain constraints, the energy prices due to the war in Ukraine. But what is the current bottleneck that we're facing in Spain? What is the big debate happening this year?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Lorena, and hi, everyone. So I'll start with a little bit of context of kind of where we've come from. So why are we kind of having this webinar today, and what's the kind of issue? So we've had in 2022 a year of kind of really kind of record solar build out. And when I talk about solar build out, I'm referring to ground mounted utility scale. We've come from about 4.5 gigawatts, maybe a little bit more if we include the islands as well. But we've also seen really record kind of build out in terms of, distributed solar, self-consumption assets as well. I think it's really those two combinations. There's two sides that is really kind of, coming together to kind of create some of these, bottlenecks that we're going to be discussing today about how to deal with them. If we kind of look at what we, maybe historically thought of what was a bottleneck for getting these projects online, it was probably, I think most people in the sector, and probably in previous conferences and webinars that we've had, most people would say it's been the permitting. And obviously we'll go into a little bit more detail on that as well. We have David here as well, who's obviously an expert. But since the kind of these regulatory milestones, the deadlines that were approved in the Royal Decree 23/2020, you know, a few years ago, we've had this kind of large kind of, you know, backlog of projects that are kind of all going through the same permitting phase at the same time. And that was really the worry, right? Was the kind of were the administrations able to cope with those projects? And the kind of the big deadline that we've seen at the beginning of the year was these environmental permits. And what we've actually seen there is kind of we at Aurora, we've kind of tried to gather all the information, and we estimate between kind of 50, 60 even gigawatts of approved capacity, which have this deadline to come online by 2025. So if we consider that we've passed this previous bottleneck, now there are other questions, right? You know, is there the manpower to get this online? Are there enough EPC contractors? What about the next stages of permitting? Although, you know, there's a little bit less uncertainty in that. There are other questions that we're facing now to kind of get all these projects online and in time. I think is that's really the time pressure, and obviously what will that do to the business case, and what will that do to kind of project profitability with so much kind of solar coming online.
Thank you for contextualizing that. It is quite impressive how the focus really was the permitting process, but did the industry really look beyond that? What was the step after that? I don't know, David, if you also agree that this is the main bottleneck for this year, for the short term.
Yes, I mean, I think Cristina has made a very good summary and touch base for me one, which is the key topic for me, which is the regulation for the Royal Decree 23/2020, which basically put at the same, let's say, permitting phase all the developments that were done at that time. That put a lot of pressure for developers, but also for the administrations in order to have, let's say, to issue the relevant permits within the relevant deadlines. The truth is that I mean, I'm following an extension, many gigawatts have already obtained environmental impact declarations, also the administrative authorizations, but we have the next one, which is the construction authorization. For me, or the view that I have is that it's really, really challenging to issue this construction authorization for such huge amount of projects. But on top of that, decisions in terms of financial investment decisions with respect to these projects must be taken within the next few months, considering the deadline of June 2025 to have the projects already operational, taking into consideration potential delays, paperwork that must be done before the authorities, also the grid operator, and the perception that we have in the firm is that it is putting a lot of pressures in terms of cost, supply value chain, and this is a situation that can be easily, let's say, changed if the administration or the regulator consider a potential extension of such deadlines, which is, we, in our view, would probably finally happen.
Mm-hmm. And Ines, I think also your experience then on an EPC side, you might see a little bit more of what comes after the permitting phase. Do you think that Spain is prepared for this wave of projects?
Well, I think that the previous scenario maybe might not be valuable to analyze what is coming next, because obviously on the manpower side, we see there is a super high demand of project managers and engineers to take hold of detailed engineering, which is crucial, not only because all the permits or many permits are asking for modifications and amendments, but also because of the natural progress of a project. There are changes along the way, and if we consider and add all the supply chain difficulties that might make it necessary to change the equipment that is part of the project, we are adding more and more difficulties. So we are facing a scenario where I believe that the most important ingredient is manpower, and how experienced are the people involved in the project to take fast decisions that are appropriate and that are correct. And obviously, we all learn from errors, so the longer the experience and the careers, the better. And this is one of the reasons why in this sector we see so many people changing jobs, because basically all the actors want the best human resources in their teams. So this is crucial. The other part that is crucial is the stocking of equipment that we might be able to get into details later, which might make different actors take hold of this stocking of the equipment to reduce risks. And we have seen a switch in who is stocking this, and there are cases where it is the investor in charge of this, and leaving the EPC contractor just to do the BOP, and this might not be interesting in terms of revenue for EPC contractors. So there is a reduction in the choices that the owner or the investor has for the EPC contractor to implement the project. Because as someone that has worked for EPC contractors, BOP is not the best scope of works. So, and this also is additional to the fact that more and more the actors in the EPC phase talk about the importance of trust and building a relationship throughout time. So if we all of a sudden change actors and who is doing the outsourcing of the equipment, this also affects the quality of the relationship and makes the whole process take longer, because you have to sit down, and maybe David knows about this, how long it takes to sign agreements, to reach the basis, especially when you're not experienced in outsourcing. People tend to think that this part of the stocking of equipment can be easy. It's just a purchasing agreement, but this is not easy at all. There are many guarantees that are related to this, many risks, and of course the pricing is also part of this trust. So there are many factors here that make us face a new scenario that is totally uncertain. And I think human addition, like the human resources, is gonna be crucial in taking the best decisions.
Thank you, Ines. And actually, we just received a question from the audience asking for a clarification of what BOP stands for. Could you clarify?
It's all the services that are needed to execute a project, to construct the project, and even commission it, but without the sourcing of the equipment. Okay, in some cases, it can be just the PV modules, which traditionally were eliminated from the scope of works, but more and more, we see the investor in charge of the main equipment. This means the PV modules, the inverter, and even the transformers.
Indeed, and Ines, if I can also just bring in an example of what is happening in the Netherlands. I had a conversation with an asset manager, and they mentioned that they found it really difficult to manage certain assets whose materials were provided by unknown suppliers or lesser known suppliers. So of course, right now, we're talking about a construction bottleneck, but maybe much like people were focused on the permitting process and not looking so much at the construction, this could easily impact the management of these assets that you have to manage for 25 plus years, right? So these asset managers were having quite a bit of a difficulty managing the manufacturing of unknown suppliers because they weren't in charge of that decision.
Correct. I mean, in this webinar, we are focusing on EPC. Otherwise, it will not be possible to address all the topics. But obviously, because we have had so many opportunities to talk about this, I believe that O&M and asset management should actually be in the beginning of the cycle instead of being in the end. and not considered until they receive the operational project. This is definitely important. As I was mentioning earlier, the guarantees, the conditions, the availability of spare parts, who is taking hold of all of this is so important. And then an additional thing to say regarding the permitting is that permitting does not consider O&M optimal conditions. Okay, so this means that obviously the design, the investor and maybe the construction phases can be appealed and seduced by implementing certain solutions that, for example, make the most out of the available land, but this is just not a good idea for a later stage. So
sorry,
yeah.
I might just to cut you off there, my apologies, but I want to bring the conversation a little bit back more towards the current bottleneck, but I think we could have a whole other webinar discussing the O&M impact of this situation, right? But
Correct.
so I'm just to bring the topic then back to the current bottleneck. I wanted to go back to, and David, maybe you can help clarify, what is feasible for, what amount of gigawatts is it feasible for Spain to install of solar energy yearly? Because if we're talking about the amount of what I think, Cristina, you mentioned 50 to 60 gigawatts that was approved, that has to be built by 2025, what is actually feasible? Is there a number that you could share, David?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, these are estimations, but are estimations based on the experience and also based on the information that, for example, through the Spanish PV Association, we have been available from our members. And it's really challenging, but our estimation is that around 7 to 8 gigawatts of capacity is the capacity sector in order for instance new facilities. It is true that under this situation it can be, let's say, a bit it can be stressed, and probably there are acceleration plans, but at the end of the day the availability of equipment, modules, inverters, transformers, workforce at some point would be limited. And to be honest, I personally think that increase such figure above 8 gigawatts would be really difficult, because on top of that, it is not a matter of if it can be made, it is also a matter of having available the funds in order to make it. And that implies negotiation with financing entities. Also, equity must take a final investment decision in this regard, and in order to do so must have visibility on whether or not it's feasible to construct and commission the projects within this deadline of June 2025. So I tend to think that it would be really difficult to increase such threshold of 7 to 8 gigawatts per year. I don't know, Cristina or Ines, if you have other different views.
And to confirm, this you mean utility scale?
Yes. I mean, but this figure is taking into consideration large-scale projects and also self-consumption. At the end of the day, we think that there is, to some extent, are connected. It is true that in the past 2-3 years, we have seen a lot of boosting of the self-consumption market as a consequence also of the subsidies and that have been available from Next Generation funds. My personal view is that to some extent such let's say track will be a bit slow in the short term for self-consumption, but again 6, 7, 8 gigawatts would be, from my point of view, the maximum of the capacity that can be installed per year.
Yes, I don't know if Cristina or Ines, you want to also comment on that estimation.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much in line with what we're seeing if we look into what we've seen historically. So, for example, large utility scale, I mentioned last year, was around about 4.5 gigawatts and around 2.5 for self-consumption. And that was really a year when there was kind of all of the incentives there to install that capacity. So there were high energy prices, there was potentially a high return that you were expecting as well. on those projects on the self-consumption side. High electricity prices. If you install those types of installations, you can, obviously reduce your costs, as an industrial, etc. I think it's going to be really difficult to reach that level again in the future. We've got a slightly lower estimation for our central case in Aurora, basically because of these new challenges in terms of the EPC that we've already discussed, and also the finding the funding. As kind of developers and investors are kind of looking for these more maybe creative solutions. So maybe I'll get some of my equipment from kind of a different provider. That is really difficult from a project financing point of view, because the bank has to okay that. You have to look at it from a legal perspective, that all these kind of guarantees with each, the more contracts you have in each project, the more complicated it is, and the harder it is to kind of comply with your covenants and the kind of requirements that the bank may have, or even your equity investor as well. And I think that's really something that is very tricky. And you also may have to be looking at, how can I mitigate all this extra solar? There's new worries now about the price. If we look at last year, we had a very high price, so merchant was potentially an option. If you're looking now, you're thinking, if we're really going to have such an increase capacity over the next few years, that is really going to crash the solar capture price potentially. Potentially, I mean, how far can we go? Obviously, it will have an impact. So maybe we're going to need to be looking at, what can I do to mitigate that? Do I need to change my strategy to a PPA? Do I need to look at installing a battery? I mean, these are kind of new questions that maybe, last year, the kind of option of I can go merchant and I can get funding for that and I can get a project finance, that was maybe a little bit more certain for a lot of the projects that are in this pipeline.
I see. And Ines, I don't know if you had a comment or, yeah.
Well, just to add something which might be interesting to have in mind or to keep in mind, is that solar power in Solar Power Europe, the European Association, gathering all the data of European countries, how much they have installed, what is the forecast, what is needed to reach the targets set by the European Union, etc. Forecasts for Spain in the following 4 years, so up to 2026, 51.2 gigas. This means 12.8 gigas per year, which would be supported by the fact that they believe there will be regulatory changes to promote a more rapid deployment, and that there would be technological improvements expected that will make it more competitive. These are the two factors they're taking in mind to set this figure. But then this would mean multiplying by 3 the implementation or deployment, the real deployment of the last 10 years. So I'm not sure we will be able to really fulfill this target, but just to make an addition. Yeah. And then lastly, I wonder if in the figures shared by David and Christina, we were considering the social aspect, because normally we tend to look at manpower, the status of the network, the financial aspects, the supply of equipment, blah, blah, blah. But are we considering the acceptance of the people owning the territories to implement the projects? Are we considering the familiarity of the Spanish community specifically with the PV technology? We have to remember that Spain started the deployment of PV with large-scale projects. We have not started with domestic projects. We are recently making families get to know the technology, become used to it, know about how profitable and how interesting it can be and how much it can contribute to the improvement of our lifestyle. This is just recent, and this has an impact in how we welcome large projects in our territories. So
Ines, in this current bottleneck that we're talking about, this projects that were approved for the environmental factor, is the community acceptance also a barrier to in the short term? Is there? It seems like there are two conflicting interests. When we talk, of course, about ESG, for example, you have the environment and the social part, but here the social and environment are in conflict in Spain. Is this a barrier to the upcoming projects?
Yeah, so in the first place, I would like to say also that regarding the permitting, which has been highlighted by my fellow speakers as an important factor, let's say highlighted and underlined, we are starting to see that projects that count with a favorable declaration of environmental impact are being stopped and modified by public entities that also have a saying, and that are including modifications and amendments that are making some projects not feasible in terms of capex and in terms of return. Okay, so this is already happening. Having this favorable declaration does not mean that you will reach a ready-to-build status because of the timing for the rest of the permits, because of many other things, but also because there can be newcomers having a saying. And normally they will come in because they see there is a rejection on the social aspects, or because there is some biodiversity or some connection with other regions that might have an impact. And so there is an additional saying. So this is also important to say, because this is a recent trend already being, let's say, suffered by some investors. But regarding your specific question,
yes, and Ines, I was also wondering if you, in this current situation, is there also a strategy that you could suggest or a best practice that people could take with the social bottleneck?
Okay, so this also, I think, is an interesting thing to add here. We are hearing more and more a message in the sector that comes normally from public authorities, but also from advisors, that it's developers. You have to do a good job about your job, because if you don't do it, you are affecting the sector with bad projects. The consideration of these projects is not going to be good enough, etc. But I believe personally that the fact that the communities have not been considered on an early stage is only a mirror of how the process has been designed. And the whole process to obtain permits, licenses, and authorizations does not consider the communities until a later stage. So now that we are learning from the errors, we definitely must include the communities from the very beginning. This has an effect in the competitivity in the market. This means me as a developer, without having a certainty that I have obtained certain permits and that I have progressed in my project, okay, why would I want to reveal that I'm starting conversations in an early stage in an area where I haven't obtained any permits, but I'm starting my conversations with the people there to see how much they welcome a project? This information is very sensitive, and the competence now is tremendous. I mean, developers are not wanting to reveal what their movements are about, because there's a lot of sensitive and critical information going on. So this is very, very difficult to deal with. And we are adding, of course, the emotional part of dealing with communities that might just not agree. And so finding a compromise and a dialogue that is fluent and that is successful is almost a role of a professional mediator, which in fact is one of the projects I'm joining right now with Mediación Verde, including mediators that have worked professionally in the domestic, let's say, side to mediate in conflicts, in marriages and in heritages, etc., and also on the industrial sectors to mediate in these conversations with a professional dialogue that even follows a Harvard scheme or tool in the conflict of interests.
Yes.
And then just to sum up and to really respond to your previous question with the conflict of interests, I think there are two dimensions here. So there is one dimension that considers the hierarchy of the decision makers. And in Spain, we have 3 levels. And we have, just to make it really short and really evident, we have the plans of the government, Spanish or the current government. We'll see what the elections bring us, but the plans of the current government that are not compulsory, but they're plans. But there is somehow an engagement with a supranational entity, which is the European Union. So we have this, and then we have the saying of the local municipalities. If these are two in conflict and there is a time when we have to take a decision of what prevails, I would expect the government to have a saying in this and make it very clear what prevails. So this is one hand side, the hierarchy. And then there is another conceptual or more abstract or more philosophical subject, which is the whole ESG concept, because E stands for the environment, stands for everything that has to do with climate change, with clean energy, with biodiversity, with the impact in the organic territory, okay?
Yeah.
And then we have the S, which includes the social impact and the acceptance of the communities. And here there is also this philosophical debate about what prevails.
All right, and it seems like this currently for this year, the projects that were approved, they're already in process. And I wonder, David, if legally could they be stopped by these local communities now that they've received at least environmental approval, or is this more of a next phase of projects that should be considered in a better format?
Well, I mean, my view is that this would be, let's say, a very case-by-case analysis. My personal feeling, I mean, what we see in the firm, also in the Spanish PV Association, is that in most of the cases, this opposition to projects is located in specific areas. I wouldn't say that, and this is a personal opinion, that it is, let's say, a matter for in all the regions, in all the territories, but it is true that there are specific areas where there is a lot of pressures in terms of projects located, let's say, within the same areas. Having said that, in the moment that we are now, with respect to ongoing developments, there are many projects that fail to obtain the environmental impact declaration, and in many cases this has been as a consequence not only from reports or positions made by other administrations other than the ones which has the competence to authorize the project. My personal experience is, for example, if a project above 50 megawatts with is processed before at the ministry level, if there has been opposition from the environmental body from the region where the project is located, in such cases, I would say that a negative environmental impact declaration has been issued. But the truth is that the projects that have already obtained this environmental impact declaration within, let's say, a process in which all parties affected by the project are heard and are, let's say, empowered to submit allegations, this type of things. I mean, the fact that there is still opposition could or should not, let's say, affect to the construction of these projects to the extent that the information, well, the technical design of the project complies with all the requirements established in the environmental impact declaration, and as well as in other reports, because at the end of the day we are in a rule of law. I mean, this is un Estado de Derecho, and I mean, and the parties that are against of a project, they have ways in order to claim, which is something that could potentially affect when you structure a project financing, the fact that you have claims or you do not have claims. But from ideological point of view, let's say a group which is, let's say, against large scale projects, because they consider that all the energy transition in terms of photovoltaic installations should be made, let's say, in roofs. I mean, it is something that we hear every day. They have the ways to claim against these projects, but we are, let's say, dealing with regulated acts. I mean, the administrative act grants rights, also obligations, and it is true that we are seeing courts that are suspending the effectiveness of some of these projects, but that should be, let's say, the way in order to defend their interest, rather than taking other type of decisions from our point of view are outside of, let's say, what we call the Estado de Derecho.
Ines, sorry, before I give you the floor, I also want to follow up with a question from the audience for David, and that it's really focusing on the deadlines that we were discussing for construction of projects that we were just talking about. And here's a question whether you expect the public administration to delay these deadlines, or what are the, and maybe for you a question, what are the different consequences that you see for this year?
Well, I mean, basically, I mean, it is not the extension of the deadlines, particularly the one related to the construction authorization, but also the deadline for the commissioning of the projects by June 2025. I would say it is not only a demand on the developers, renewable associations, but also from what we are seeing from the civil servants, which are in charge of processing these projects. At the end of the day, not only the developers, but also the administrations have devoted a lot of time, a lot of thousands of hours to process such huge amount of projects. And just for the benefit of the audience, why we are, let's say, focusing this bottleneck is because many projects have obtain these environmental impact declarations with conditions that implies the need to include such amendments in the technical projects that are submitted to obtain this construction authorization. As a consequence of such changes, projects must face again a public hearing process, which takes 1 month, but in practice we all know that legal terms, let's say, are extended in practice, and it is materially impossible that such projects can be processed within this short deadline. And apart from that, we are also seeing, and maybe Cristina could give us, let's say, more views about impact of lower prices, also expected for the future, also curtailment. And on top of that, the call for general elections by the 23rd of July. All within a context in which regional governments, which are also in charge of processing these projects, have elections 2 weeks ago and have still not, let's say, appointed relevant or the new people in charge of the services that must process these projects. So it's like the perfect storm. And my question, and I think the demand of the sector is, okay, it is not a matter, which was the rationale behind this regulation of 2020, including the deadlines, to eliminate projects that were speculative. I think we are in a different scenario in 2023. The project has been, let's say, processed, many resources has been devoted from the administration and also the developers. And I think at the point when a project has environmental impact declaration, administrative authorization, and it is close to obtain the construction authorization, we are not talking about the speculative projects, and the regulator must take a decision whether to create a regulatory atmosphere that, let's say, allow to bring these projects to ready to build or not. and such decision is the expression of the deadline or not. Otherwise, we will probably lose a lot of gigawatts of projects, and that will create a stop or frozen of the sector for many years in a context of energy, let's say, crisis.
Thank you, David, because we were getting quite a few questions regarding expectations for these deadlines. And I know, Ines, that we could still dive deeper into the discussion on the social side, but I also want to give attention to this immediate impact of the deadlines for this year. But I believe you yourself are seeing certain delays on the permitting side due to the social acceptance. So it is something that is happening, and it's also to be taken into account, right, Ines?
Yeah, just a very subtle comment, because I totally follow what David is saying. And of course, the law rules with what is stated expressly in the law. Although we can't take that as something to be prevailing in time, because Spain has suffered a lot of regulatory changes. That is something to say. But considering the current law, there is a tacit reality, and this is many regions are setting a moratorium, I mean on a municipal level, asking for transparency about the land use planning. And so this relates to the fact that, yes, there are regions that are clearly expressing their opposition, whereas there are other regions that are neutral or even favorable, but they have still not received the projects. So they are lacking the knowledge of what is really going to be implemented. And on the other hand side, actually the government is not so able to transfer this information about how the land use planning will be in reality, because they still don't know which projects are really going to be implemented.
Yeah.
So there is a request of information that cannot be fulfilled.
Yeah, it's clear that the knowledge sharing aspect has to be worked on, and also communities have to be involved earlier on, or else the fact that you're discussing moratoriums for certain projects, that could be a big hindrance for developers. So we could discuss a whole other webinar on this topic, and hopefully we will. But it's a great perspective to add, Ines. And going back to the topic of what are the consequences of these deadlines that we are facing now, I think, Christina, maybe from Aurora's side, are there also any expectations that you're seeing?
Yeah, and I'd say, I think, first of all, I completely agree with what David said about kind of, sometimes we think, obviously we have what's like currently in place in terms of regulation and the law, etc. But it is important to kind of think of what was the actual purpose of this kind of regulation in the first instance, and it was completely to try and avoid this kind of speculative market that we were seeing in Spain. That doesn't mean necessarily that there will be a change, but I personally do believe as well that there will be extension of the deadlines. However, of course, if you think about an potential extension of the deadlines, that I would think that would mean more accelerated build out for a longer period of time. So, for example, it wouldn't just be this kind of rush until 2025. We would have there's so many projects in the pipeline that the rush would continue up to 2027. And while that's obviously a positive thing in terms of kind of some regulatory stability and clarity in terms of, these projects kind of will make it, that obviously does have an impact in the prices. And if we don't see demand kind of catching up with that accelerated build out, then I think we'd all probably expect that we would get to similar figures, maybe 2030, 2035. But obviously we're not going to see this kind of reaction of demand in that sense in such a near term. And there's also other effects to consider, such as David mentioned as well, the curtailment. So I think in terms of what can be done in the near term, I think it's just really important to understand kind of these new risks that maybe everyone expected to come in the future, but we're seeing them now. So there are other decisions to be made as well for kind of, early stage projects, in terms of my location is going to be ever more important in terms of where I'm going to be putting my project from a curtailment point of view. Obviously, not just in terms of curtailment, am I going to expect to receive kind of some pushback from the local community there? The locational aspect is kind of just becoming more and more important. You're going to have to be thinking of, where am I going to actually be buying my equipment from? How expensive is that going to be? There's a different context for the capex as well. There's a lot of kind of new things that, maybe we go back even just a year and a half ago that wasn't kind of at the forefront of everybody's minds. And it's important to think about what mitigations I can do in terms of the easiest thing, and I'm not saying it's easy, but it's probably the easiest, is to kind of think, okay, how can I potentially mitigate my revenue situation from a PPA perspective, optimizing my revenue streams? Do I go for the auction? Do I go for a PPA? Do I go for a mix? I think that's the most important thing going forward.
Thanks, Christina. It's great that you mentioned that. I guess one of the strategies right now is just to understand these new risks, because we are in a new phase of the market, and maybe everyone working in the renewable energy industry can recognize how fast-paced it is, and you really have to stay up to date with what's happening. And we've been answering already the questions from the audience throughout the webinar, and I'm going to answer this one that hasn't been approached yet to kind of close off the conversation before your final comments. But just so you know, we have a question here from Enrique Alonso Sanchez, SVEA Solar, and it's regarding financing. So maybe Christina, you can also take this on. So there are duck curves appearing on the electricity market, and you have kind of mentioned financing as a bottleneck. Do you think that banks will require PPAs to be firmed for financing to be available? That is the question.
I think really I think the majority of banks have always kind of required some kind of structure for PPA, and kind of, there's always been a limited amount of kind of funding available for a merchant projects, and even within those banks or financing institutions that will offer project financing on a merchant basis, it's always been a very, very small part of kind of what their overall portfolio is. I think in that sense, it's not too much of a change. I think banks will also have to try and understand, how much of this duck curve and 0-hour prices. What is important in a project financing at the end of the day is, can my debt be repaid? And my debt isn't being repaid on an hourly basis. My debt is being repaid usually either on a quarterly basis or each semester basis. So if I can have certainty over my cash flow and my kind of the amount of cash that I will have in this project at that time, then I think, project financing will continue, and potentially on a merchant basis. What banks will probably look for is higher guarantees, more strict kind of covenants, higher debt service coverage ratios, maybe shorter tenors. They will look for ways to kind of compensate this increased risk, but obviously there's money there, there's liquidity in the market, and it's just a matter of understanding how to mitigate these
PPAs
risks.
were already very popular in Spain, and we don't expect that to change, basically.
Exactly.
Indeed, so I think we are reaching the end of our conversation, and I'll ask my colleague to put up the slides on the screen. But it seems pretty clear that the current bottleneck, at least right now with the permitting and building out these projects that received the approval for the permitting, it's still a question mark. Even from this conversation amongst the three of you, there is no clear solution unless you can expect the government to extend these deadlines or not. So are you more optimistic for the near future, or what are your expectations now? I'll let anyone take this on.
I honestly don't know what to say. I think that I'm not so optimistic about really reaching a large amount of projects being executed, but that would be a step in making some changes. regulatory changes, and hopefully for European manufacturers to help in this process. We see more and more, and recently one investor and IPP was announcing an agreement with a local manufacturer in Spain, located in a province where they have 3 projects, and considering that the outsourcing of the equipment will be possible by the end of 2023. So we are starting to see real industrial projects in the sector that will certainly help to push this forward. So I'm confident about this, that the industrial planning of manufacturing will also help. But just to catch up on what Christina said about the importance of the location regarding curtailment, this leads to a further limitation in the choice of the land. So this also is a conflict. We don't have endless choices of land in the current situation. So this is also something that is important.
Great. No, and thank you, Ines, for your comments. I think if you had a crystal ball, you would be able to tell us, yes, I'm optimistic because of X, Y, Z. But I guess right now, much like Christina also said, you're preparing yourself for these new risks, such as one of them being the location due to curtailment and so on. Is that what you also see, David? Are you more in a preparation phase for what could be the near future?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm still optimistic because, to be honest, I think, I mean, and based on the conversation that we have, I think that we can be reasonable aligned in the sense that these tight deadlines are putting a lot of pressure in many things that around a project. I mean, and to the extent that these deadlines are finally extended, that would imply that developers will have more time to negotiate with local communities. That would imply the declaration of public utility will be less used, let's say, in order to secure the land, particularly for evacuation lines, because in my experience is that for the generation plant, this is not, I mean, at this stage, it's a matter that should be already solved. Having more time would imply that the government could approve policies that are demanded from the European Union in terms of fostering storage, both for batteries, both for pump storage, that also will have, let's say, an impact on the visibility of investors regarding scenarios of lower prices. Having more time would imply that the government could call for new auctions that will have also grant visibility for the revenues of these projects, or to negotiate PPAs, but not with the pressure that just PPAs must be negotiated before July, August this year. So at the end of the day, I think there are a lot of signals that recommends to the regulator to extend such deadlines, because as I mentioned, such deadlines were approved in a situation where I think we can all agree that there was, let's say, a feel of speculation, but this is not the scenario that we currently have with respect to these projects that are very close to ready to build. So I expect, let's say, a diligent decision from our authorities that hears the demands from the sector and also from the administrations themselves, particularly the civil servants, which are in charge of processing these projects.
That's a great point, David. Indeed, going back to the reason that these regulations were put out, and also it sounds like you have quite a bit of faith in that if all the signals point to a specific decision, that they will be taking the right one. So I'm with you there. I try to have faith in our politicians.
But we haven't mentioned the political situation, the current political situation. So will the regulator really understand this need of extending the periods, like considering that they will be also guided by a potential different government?
I think that is a question that I'll leave open also to the audience, but I will mention one thing that I think resonates from what David said, which was the signals come also from the market, not just from the regulators themselves. So I hope that they are not deaf to that information, rather they're new or old, but that is just my personal opinion. Another webinar topic, Ines, that we'll host next week, we'll see. And finally, Christina, I don't know for yourself if you're also more on the optimistic or pessimistic side, or more just realist.
Yeah, I was going to say I think I'm a bit more realistic. I think I'm optimistic that the projects will get there. I think the deadlines will be extended, and I think that will provide a lot of security and a lot of visibility for investors. And I think that's really important, and maybe not been something that unfortunately that kind of Spain historically has enjoyed as a sector. There's been a lot of changes historically, and I think some stability and visibility can only be positive. So in that sense, I am optimistic. I'm a little bit more pessimistic on kind of like how these projects will actually be able to kind of achieve like their kind of required profitability. We have increasing capex. The large amount of renewables coming online will only decrease prices. I think we need to get comfortable with a lower price scenario, especially for solar, which can definitely be mitigated. But anything that can kind of help the overall kind of system will come a little bit later. It will be very difficult for kind of anything, large scale storage deployment, hydrogen, green hydrogen, demand growth, etc. All of these things will come a little bit later with a little bit of a delay, and I think that will be the real challenge once these projects are kind of online. What are we then talking about in profitability, and is that acceptable for the investors?
Thank you, Christina. Sounds like another webinar topic on the future of financing with these new technologies and this delay. I think one common topic I saw in this conversation with all three of you, and I thank you so much for participating, is the growth of the market is almost too fast in relation to other aspects of technology, such as green hydrogen and storage, or just in terms of regulation and how quickly can they adjust to what developers are putting out there. So it really is a collaborative effort to make this work with the communities, or hiring new people, or maybe even waiting for people to graduate from university to be able to get hired. So what I see, especially in conversations like with stakeholders like the three of you, is that there are very committed people in this industry looking to make things work. So at least in that front, it's very optimistic to have you, Ines, and David and Christina discussing this in this webinar, because it shows us that you are willing to bring this forward. So thank you so much for joining in this conversation. And for those who are interested to continue talking about solar in Spain, we have our conference on the 6th of July in Madrid at the Casino de Madrid, and you're invited to join. And I don't know if you saw, but there's also a discount code for those who attended this webinar. With that, I'd like to give you all one more round of thank you, and I'd like to close off this webinar. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you, Lorena, and David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.